Hey, Welsh Metals. Today I will be showing a tutorial on where all the precious metals are located inside of a generic motherboard. So here we have the motherboard in question. It's quite old and dusty. It's a GF8200E. That biostar there is the make of the circuit board itself. There's the processor, which is actually dated 2006. You can see there. I don't know, is that an 8? It's an 8, 2008, fair enough. This material here, seen on the top, this grey gunk, is actually thermal paste, which contains some silver. So we'll have a look at the best things first, that being the gold. Most is located inside of this, the CPU. There's a large heatsink on the top, there, quite thick. That is made of a pure type of copper with some nickel mixed into it. The green substrate of the PCB, the board here, you can see the green outline. Underneath that is gold microfilaments, and there's the very shiny gold pins on the bottom. Look at that, incredibly shiny. And this is a high yield material on these pins. Quite a lot of gold can be recovered from them, as can the circuit board itself. It's sandwiched in between the heatsink and all these incredibly reflective pins, which are extremely heavily plated in gold. So there's the processor. That's the main thing you'll be looking for. That contains all sorts of good stuff, large amounts of gold, copper, nickel, and there's also some solder in there that attaches these pins. Let's have a quick look at that at ×30 magnification so I can show you what I mean. See them little beads at the bottom of the pins? That's a tiny amount of silver solder on there, which contains silver and tin and possibly antimony as well. Although this is a high quality chip, as in most CPUs are, so it's highly likely more silver than tin. So, put that aside. Very pretty piece that, very shiny. Now, let's look at here. See these tiny pins, holes? That was the slot the chip went into. These actually contain gold within the tiny holes on incredibly small pins. So more gold recovery materials. Can't really see them as they are sandwiched into little tiny forks within these tiny holes, which grip the pins when you open them like so. See if you can see a better angle there. Nope. So, see that? As I move it across, you can just about see those forks, all gold plated. See them within there? So I slide the locking mechanism across. So there is minute amounts of gold still under there. Try not to miss that when you're scrapping the circuit boards. So here we have MLCCs, these little brown things. These contain silver, some iron, but chiefest of all the rare metal Palladium, 2% around, maybe more depending on the size of the MLCC. Palladium is extremely valuable and rare, more so than gold, so definitely worth collecting. Here we have lots more materials. These tiny ones there are resistors, which contain small amounts of silver. There's also a series resistor there that says what looks like Li, IEE written up on it. That's a series resistor. Connects to multiple things. That's why it's got lots of legs. Now these can contain trace metals such as ruthenium and rhodium. Extremely rare, exotic, rare earth metals. Here we have a transistor, or it might be a transformer, no, it's a transistor. That is used for moving power between things like motor drivers. They're transistors as well, these tiny things. power amplifiers and such. Maybe MOSFETs, so electronic switches. They're quite similar. You'd have to identify the code upon them to find exactly what component it is. But these contain, similar to the other solders, much iron within these, bit of tin, antimony and silver. Same within these microchips, but usually more, sometimes microfilaments of gold can be contained within these, but not all, only some. So let's have a look at some more things. These black squares here are actually toroidal transformers contained within a ceramic block. So there is copper within here, quite a bit of it, and iron and magnetic material in the case. We have an uncased version of that there. That's a toroidal transformer. You can see the shiny copper material there, which is most likely an alloy of copper rather than pure copper. And you've got the bead in the middle, which is a ferromagnetic bead, so mainly iron and some magnetic material. Lots more MLCCs there, more palladium. Now these capacitors are a pure type of aluminium, so small value to them. They can also be silver plated, most are. So let's go on to some other materials now. Timing crystals. So these are oscillators, timing crystals for things like the clock within the circuit board itself, and these can contain silver and gold. The small tubular ones, these ones, I have noticed can contain small parts of gold instead of the silver element usually used for the small disc that is contained within to supply the oscillation current. These ones I have a video upon to show how much silver is within them. There's quite a bit within them. They're also pure aluminium cased, similar to the capacitors, and silver plated. So we have a microchip here, quite a sizable one, surrounded by a bank of resistors and transistors for power switching. This was for controlling these SATA ports for hard drive control, and this likely contains some gold in a small amount somewhere within that chip, and the black ceramic silicon die that is on the top of it. These are gold plated, these connectors, the SATA connectors. Spin that round and show. Might need some magnification upon that. Can barely see, but these are in fact gold plated, small amounts on all the connectors there in a strip. It's very thin, usually single-sided plate, but there is gold material to be had. So we have pins here, very shiny pins. There are lots of these on motherboards, including on the serial connectors. These are the old type connectors for the big fat hard drives that usually don't get used anymore and are good for nothing but scrap. Hardly anybody uses these apart from for use of floppy drives and things like that for old games. These are all gold plated and with copper underneath. I have melted these down into many scrap gold buttons before, and they all come out quite nice. Make a nice sort of brass material. That there, with that small white line upon it, is a blocking diode. They contain tiny amounts of the metal tantalum, rare heavy metal. You can see the gold better there on them connectors, reflecting quite nicely. Some are more thickly plated than others. You can see that for yourself. Lots more palladium capacitors here, palladium based capacitors, and more microchips for controlling things like audio and USBs. These contain similar elements to the other microchips, gold and silver in trace amounts. Now these long PCI strips and the single graphics card strip here. these also contain small tiny teeth, single-sided, plated with gold all the way in. They can be quite difficult to remove in my experience. They have to be removed from underneath and then pulled out, usually individually, or crushed and burned, which is the more dangerous, hazardous and environmentally damaging option than doing it physically, which is laborious and gives you lots of scars, but does result in a better recovery ratio from these sort of materials. You have some carbon based resistors there. Again, they contain things like silver. Now the circuit board itself here is covered in traces. See those traces? These traces are actually a type of heavy copper, which is an extremely pure type of copper. So the board itself has quite a weight to it, and that is where the weight comes from. More power switching devices here. That's a electronic switch. Quite a lot of electronic switches in here. These are not gold plated pins, these are likely silver plated. Indeed they are. So some silver plate upon these pins here to go along with the capacitors. Now let's look at some more materials. The main sockets for all the audio and the Ethernet and things, and the USB. So you can see the gold plate there for the Ethernet connector. That is only single-sided plate on most of these connections. Now the USBs also contain small amounts of gold within them. You can see that there. The audio connectors, they can also contain gold, all of which will be plated. You've got a printer connector here. These are actually quite good for gold recovery due to the small pieces within. You can see there are small fine connectors within there, small grippy bits. VGA connector, same again. And here we have a very old PC connector for keyboards and mouses, no longer generally used. The age of this board suggests that it's quite an old motherboard. Now these cases are in fact steel, plated with zinc, like most things, like screws. These are standoff screws here. You can screw other screws into these. Quite useful. You can make a variety of things and stands from these once you collect a whole lot of them. I have, which are handy for holding things in electronics. I have another inducer here. That's another toroidal type transformer. Lots of copper wrapped around that in a coil for induction. And these are silver plated here for the auxiliary power slot. And we've gone over most of the board now. Let's check over by the timing crystals once again. Now this is the battery connector for the timing crystals power, which are right next to it, as you can see. And that's silver plated, as you can probably tell. Now these things, jumper pins, these also contain small amounts of gold and are generally used for bridging connectors, these things, to switch modes and switches between the case itself, usually for the audio connector and such like that, between the case and the back of the board. And we have a wind-bombed chip here. That's a timing chip. That probably doesn't contain too much. Tiny amounts of silver most likely, rather than gold, as it's not an incredibly vital component. Here we have a graphics chip. This was burned out a long time ago on these old type boards, like most do. Most people end up using the graphics card, which connects here. So this is burned out. You can see the silicon die in the middle there, caked with thermal paste. That stuff, as I said, can contain silver. It also can contain the metal indium. Look again at that stuff. You can see some has been scraped off. when I remove the heatsink from both these things, so you can see them better. Now these contain quite a bit of gold once you snap them open, and are good for recovery. I have videos on examining those and tearing them to pieces in order to expose the gold dye within. Quite a lot of gold in them, as I've said. So let's flip the board now. That's for the back of the CPU that I showed at the start of the video. Massive MLCCs, or Palladium based. But they also contain other things like silver, depending what you're after. Although it is possible to isolate all the different metals within them, but difficult. So here we have very, very shiny solder. This is likely tin antimony based, as it's not on a overly vital component like the CPU. So if it does contain silver, it will only contain a small amount. However, tin and antimony are both quite valuable. This board was made after the 90s, so it's highly unlikely that it contains lead solder, which means this will melt at a higher temperature. I also have videos on how to recover all these components. There's generally several different methods: heat recovery, pneumatic recovery, even a vacuum suction from a soldering iron to remove these bits. I have videos upon all of them. It can be challenged to remove all the components and get a good recovery ratio of about 98% of the components. You will always lose some shot off into the distance if you recover them pneumatically, or burned if you recover them with heat. So that was a full breakdown of all the precious metal within the generic motherboard. Took quite a while to describe all that. So have a quick little look at that CPU. That is very, very pretty. All that gold. Extremely reflective. So, till next time.